Step into the time machine. Let's travel through the past. Mr. Gold's gonna take you on a history blast. From ancient civilizations to the world wars. Get ready, hold tight, breathe.
Hey guys, in this video I want to give an overview of our civil rights unit. If you check out the definition here, civil rights refers to the rights of individuals to receive equal treatment and be free from unfair treatment or discrimination in a number of settings, including education, employment, housing, and more. So when we talk about civil rights, this presentation is going to be tailored towards the U.S. civil rights movement roughly between the years of 1896 and 1968. So that doesn't mean that civil rights movements aren't occurring constantly around the world. This is just to direct our attention towards the foundational movements that occurred in the United States, starting with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So when we talk about civil rights in the U.S., it really revolves around this idea of, is separate truly equal? Can we have separate schools? Can we have separate railroads, separate water fountains? And in 1896, the Supreme Court actually said yes, separate was equal. There could be separate train cars, and it was justified to have someone of mixed race sit in a different car than someone who was considered all the way white. This case revolves around Plessy, who was 1/8 black, 7/8 white, according to his grandparents, and they made him sit in the segregated, the quote-unquote black car in this case. This brings about the Jim Crow movement in the United States, where there was Jim Crow laws prohibiting equal treatment in all these states on the map, which are in red. And later, Germany is going to borrow these Jim Crow laws when they separate Jewish Germans from the quote pure Aryan Germans. So this idea is really a foundational idea for modern segregation. Here's a picture of colored and white restrooms. Here's a picture of the separate water fountains. So if you were black or mixed race, you had to drink in the colored one, and white Americans were drinking out of the white one. So to inform this unit, there's two types of segregation that we're going to be talking about. You have de facto segregation, where this is segregation that happens without law. It would just happen by social preference. It could be economic factors, social factors, just personal preference factors. For example, if elderly people like to sit in a certain section of a restaurant and young people like to sit at the bar, that would be de facto segregation. They're just choosing to sit in those places. The second type of segregation, which is a lot more harmful and dangerous, and which was occurring during the Jim Crow laws, was de jure segregation, segregation by law. So in this form of segregation, let's say the elderly people wanted to sit at the bar, and the young people were like, hey, you can't sit here. It's illegal. You have to be below the age of 65 to sit here. That would be de jure segregation. So de facto is by choice, de jure by law. And here's a map that shows housing patterns, where the blue dots are congregating in one area and the beige dots are in another. That would be de facto. And then on the right, you have an example of de jure, where like schools were banning students based on race. So the very first important event in our discussion of segregation is Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. So this case actually overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, and makes it so public schools cannot separate based on race. Um, it's a really important case for education as well as for just equality and civil rights in the U.S. But there was some problems with Brown versus Board where it didn't actually have a huge impact at the time that it was passed. One of those major problems that came from Brown versus Board is that the Supreme Court said they must desegregate with all deliberate speed. They must desegregate the schools with all deliberate speed. So deliberate speed can mean different things to different people. If you tell a track star, I want you to get across the street with all deliberate speed, they're going to be going a lot faster than someone who might have just had knee surgery with their deliberate speed. So certain states desegregate right away. There's a lot of holdouts. For example, Texas, Georgia, many of the southern states, they're still segregated 20 years later. Where I'm from in St. Louis, there were schools that didn't fully desegregate till the mid-'80s. 1983 was when really the buses started to desegregate these schools fully. So all deliberate speed was a weakness of Brown versus Board of Education, but at least it was better than Plessy versus Ferguson, where separate is equal. At least Brown versus Board of Education acknowledged separate was inherently unequal. Next year, so summer of 1955, you have the Emmett Till case, which was brought about by a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago visiting relatives in Mississippi. He was accused of doing like a wolf call or a whistle at a white woman in a store, sort of like or like that type was what he was accused of. And back then it was really a severe thing for that to happen between different races of people. Today it might happen more often where people just whistle it on the street or do those cat calls and stuff. But back then that was a really big deal if he actually did it. And he was attacked, kidnapped, tortured, and attacked by the fiance / husband of the woman, and also another relative from that family. So they tortured Emmett Till. His body was later found in this river, and it seemed like the whole town knew what was happening, why his body was found, but the court was not fair. They did not, even though people knew what happened, and the murderers actually later confessed to the crime, but the all-white jury failed to acquit the murderers, and this led to a nationwide outrage towards the justice system in Mississippi. It made it very clear that black Americans were not given a fair trial and not given justice in the legal system because people knew that he was murdered. They knew why he was murdered. It was a small town. People understood the situation, but they still couldn't get justice for Emmett Till. So that summer of 1955, it leads to a demand by black Americans for legal reform so they can get fair trials. And then winter 1955 is a very pivotal case. Rosa Parks, she was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama for sitting in the black section of the bus. But in that situation, when the white section of the bus was full of people, blacks were told that they had to get up and give their seat to whites. She was in the front of the black section. She was asked to get up. She refused. Bus driver had her arrested. And 5 days later, a lot of African Americans call for boycotting of the bus. And one of those famous civil rights leaders is Martin Luther King Jr. He's leading the boycott of the Montgomery bus system. The bus boycott lasts for 381 days, cost the bus company tons of money because up to 75% of the riders of the bus were African American. And so when all the African American riders boycott the bus loses a lot of money. And a lot of times, sadly, in America, people don't make changes until they feel economic pressure. They don't do it on moral grounds a lot of times. It's based on, can I afford to do this or not? And so the bus company will eventually desegregate in Montgomery, and it also leads to Martin Luther King Jr. becoming a famous voice for African American civil rights at this time. Next, so Rosa Parks, winter of 1955. Now we're in 1957, the Little Rock Nine. These were 9 students in Little Rock, Arkansas, who, after Brown versus Board of Education ordered the schools to desegregate, these 9 students attempt to attend Central High School. The governor, Faubus, who's very racist against blacks, tries to block the students from entering the high school, and a lot of protesters also try to block the students from entering the high school. Here's a picture of the governor with local white activists trying to block the students from entering. They've got their American flags and their signs that says, no, race mixing is wrong, stop race mixing, and they're fighting to keep the school white. Eventually, the black students are escorted by the National Guard and by law enforcement. It took 1,000 members of the U.S. Airborne Division to come and escort them, just because there was so much counter-protest, or I guess you'd call it, they were protesting against Brown versus Board of Education, so we call it counter-protesting of Brown versus Board in that racist part of Arkansas. So these are the Little Rock Nine, right before they attended school with the leader of the NAACP. And a connection to today, if you guys follow the NFL, there's a picture of the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. He was actually at the protest on the opposite side of the Little Rock Nine, and they interviewed him later, and they were like, "What were you doing there?" And he said, "Oh, I was just there out of curiosity." So there's the Dallas Cowboys owner out of curiosity, facing off on the other side of the Little Rock Nine. Now in 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina, you have the lunch counter sit-ins. These sit-ins were protests where people would sit at counters in where black Americans were not allowed to eat, and they would sit there, and if they didn't get served by the staff, they would just continue to wait in the all-white restaurants, taking up seats. And eventually people got angry that they were protesting for their right to eat at the lunch counter. So in this picture you see some of the white counter protesters pouring milkshakes and yelling at the protesters. One interesting thing about the Greensboro sit-ins is it begins to incorporate white allies into the protest. So you see there's a white guy here with the black protesters. He's also getting the milkshake poured on him. And that sort of takes the protest up a notch, because it shows that it's not just black civil rights protesters. There's also white younger college students that are helping the movement, and that's going to spread the movement much faster when the white allies sit and get the milkshakes poured on them as well. So this protest says it marks the first time that white protesters joined. And when the white protesters join, it begins to spread around college towns, early 1960. And you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee also creating protests at this time. It started on the campus of Shaw University in Rolla. Later, 2 months later, they're coordinating sit-ins and they're publicizing their activities so people in the media and around the country can share the story and get more attention towards civil rights. Next, you have the Freedom Riders. This was mobile protests on buses that traveled around the south of the United States. They would go from different public transportation hubs and raise awareness and challenge the local laws of segregation. They needed armed protection in many cases because people attacked the buses, mainly white counter protesters. And in the bottom right, you can see a picture of the Freedom Riders bus being burned. Here's another picture of the violence that they faced. The Freedom Riders would be sometimes attacked. They'd have their lives threatened based on what town they were traveling in. Now in 1962, you have the case of James Meredith. Meredith was a U.S. Air Force veteran, and he had the opportunity to enroll in college after he was done serving. And Mississippi, since it's a public, University of Mississippi is a public institution, according to Brown versus Board, he should be allowed to go there. He had the money, he had the scholarships, he had the ability academically to go there. But because of the hatred and the racism of the school, many people protested his entrance into Mississippi, University of Mississippi. And it sparked protests across the campus. Many people, even people that weren't students there, jumped in to protest him going there. Eventually a deal is made with Robert F. Kennedy to where James Meredith is allowed to attend the university. The only problem was while he's allowed to attend, people are heckling him and threatening to kill him while he's in school. So he faces a number of injustices while he's attending University of Mississippi. He still is able to complete his education there. And the U.S. again had to send the military to a southern state to allow black students to enter a school. So in Arkansas, we saw they had to send 1,000 troops. In Mississippi, 5 years later, they have to send 3,000 troops. And Robert Kennedy just to get him into the university. So it shows that it's not an easy path. It's full of obstacles and hate and threats to get an education. But that's sort of the process of each of these changes. You have someone wanting to change something, huge backlash, protest, fights, even death sometimes, and then the pressure eases up a little bit and people gain a few more rights and a few more opportunities. 1963, you have the March on Washington. This is probably every middle schooler in America has heard the speech, "I Have a Dream," by Martin Luther King. And hundreds of thousands of people show up, and it really puts the civil rights movement on the national stage versus just these small schools and these small towns where the fights are happening. This is nationwide. People of all different races, ethnicities, genders, backgrounds, ages are attending, and it's really a galvanizing point for the movement. Later, this march is accredited with passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I have a link to the speech in the slides here. When you get to this point, you can watch the speech. I love watching it. I've watched it hundreds of times. Each year I teach civil rights. I watched it with my classes, and it's just a great speech. It never gets old. Here's the picture of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 getting signed into law. Kennedy wanted to be the president that did this, but he was assassinated several months before the law passed, so his vice president, who took over, ended up signing it. 1965, Southern Christian Leadership Conference creates the March on Selma, Alabama. This is a 50-mile march. The goal of the march was to get national attention on black voting rights. During the march, their police line up across the Selma Bridge, and they begin beating and pepper spraying the protesters as they try to cross to go to the state capitol. It's all televised, and it's recorded on video, so certain times when there's pictures, it's hard to tell the true story, but when it's on video and you see the police beating and macing and pepper spraying people, there's no denying how terrible the racism is at this point, and it really shines the light on Alabama and their practices of banning African Americans and keeping them from voting. The Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. It outlaws discriminatory practices such as literacy tests, poll taxes, or anything else that's an obstacle to African Americans voting. And I've included a link to the test that Alabama was making African Americans take to vote, and it's a pretty difficult test. And even if people aced the test, sometimes the Alabama officials would keep them from voting, and they never really shared the results with the people that took the test. So if they told you failed, you had to just take their word that you failed and you couldn't vote. So pretty unfair. 1965, the Watts riots. These are large-scale riots in Los Angeles in the Watts neighborhood. 35 people were killed, 2,000 injured, and 3,952 were arrested. So the riots were a reaction to police brutality that was occurring, and also job and housing discrimination. So these Watts riots, that same neighborhood is going to have riots many more times for civil rights later on in history, but this is just the first to occur, the biggest one also. One of our leaders of civil rights who I want to draw attention to is Malcolm X. His initial name was Malcolm Little, but as he became incarcerated for robbery, he found Islam and changed his name to Malcolm X. But he viewed Malcolm Little as his slave name, and Malcolm X was like his name of choice. Interesting thing about Malcolm X, instead of preaching nonviolence and like turn the other cheek, sort of how Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks got their civil rights, he was not for that. He was actually the opposite of turn the other cheek. If someone hits you, you hit them back. If someone does violence to you, you do violence to them back. And he preached that for a good chunk of his career. One of his famous speeches that are in our civics resources is the ballot or the bullet, where if he couldn't reach the changes through voting, he advocated using violence and revolution. The same way the U.S. overthrew Great Britain to get its independence, he believed blacks should fight for their independence, use the methods that have worked throughout history, such as like guns and revolt. Eventually, he's killed in 1964. He leaves the Nation of Islam in 1964, and then he's killed in 1965. So he was giving a speech in New York. Assassins came up and shot him during the speech. Here we have the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement. So the Black Power movement, instead of being timid and still using civil disobedience, this movement advocated standing up, fighting back, showing power. And one of the flashpoints of the Black Power movement occurs in 1968 when Tommy Smith and John Carlos are protesting in the Olympics. Tommy got first place and John got third place. And during the national anthem, they held up the closed fist to symbolize Black Power, as well as standing in their socks instead of wearing shoes to represent the poverty and the oppression that blacks were facing. They were later punished and removed from the Olympic team for this protest. So there was consequences for it. They received death threats and lots of hate. Then you have the Black Panther Party. We're going to go into more details about the Black Panther Party, but it was marked with lots of assassinations of their leaders and lots of backlash from the U.S. government, specifically the CIA and COINTELPRO, who tried to infiltrate the organization and lead the assassination of some of the members. Finally, one of the major, we call it like the end point of this period of the civil rights movement. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel while he prepared to give a speech. And the assassination of MLK leads to protests in hundreds of U.S. cities. He was really the last voice for nonviolence in the 1960s. Once he's assassinated violently, a lot of Black Americans feel like nonviolence isn't working, and so there's collective riots across the country. And there's also a lot of mourning for MLK. We still have a holiday for him today, so he's not forgotten, and his message is not forgotten about nonviolence. But at that time, people really were getting tired of nonviolence, and so they decided to revolt and express their rage that way. Right after King's assassination, there's a second part of the Civil Rights Act that's passed. So you have one in 1964, and then the second part, 1968. This allows for equal housing opportunity. People are no longer denied housing based on race, and it really fights back against the practice of redlining and segregated housing. So it's also known as the Fair Housing Act. So you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Civil Rights Act Part 2 of 1968 that are the major legislations that are passed at this time. So that does it for our civil rights presentation. I hope this was informative to you guys, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, and take care.
Step into the time machine. Let's travel through the past. Mr. Gold's gonna take you on a history blast from ancient